But it is an important topic, and there's one chapter in the book that uses archival material. For instance, statistics from public security bureaus compiled immediately in the aftermath of the famine, 62, 63, 64, or mass investigation teams that were sent by provincial party committees to find out what had happened. And on the basis of a whole range of statistics that have never been published, I come to the conclusion that the earlier estimate of about 30 to 32 million people who died unnecessarily from 58 to 62 has to be increased to at least 45 million people. It's a mind-boggling number. Mind-boggling number. In the case of Sichuan alone, a province that is about twice the size of France, the man in charge of the Provincial Public Security Bureau writes directly a report full of numbers to the head of that province, Li Qingquan, explaining to Li Qingquan that since 1958, 8 to 10 million people have died unnecessarily in Sichuan alone. That's a report that's never been seen before. Extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. And about 6 to 8% of those who died unnecessarily were actually killed violently, summarily executed, buried alive, tortured to death. Also, an estimate which is very vague, yet based on a whole series of extremely precise reports. Don't forget, one-party states, like the one under Stalin, like the one under Hitler, tend to document things in great detail. So 6 to 8% means roughly 2 to 3 million people were deliberately killed during this period. That is more than the total number of victims during Pol Pot's reign in Cambodia. But the estimates range from 1.7 to 2.4 million in total, a fraction of which was killed violently. You take Pol Pot and what happened in Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge, you multiply it by 20, and you get roughly somewhere near what happened in China from 1958 to 1962. The scale of horror. This counts as one of the greatest man-made catastrophes in human history. This must range, along with the crimes against humanity committed by Stalin and those committed against humanity by Hitler, as one of the three greatest disasters of the 20th century. Let me move on. Because when we talk about destruction, so far I've only been talking about human beings, the destruction of human lives, in the countryside in particular. But radical collectivization does a lot more. In fact, radical collectivization destroys the whole social economic system on which Mao had staked his prestige. Take, for instance, housing. Housing is not a topic that one usually associates with destruction when it comes to famine. Of course, in Bengal in the 1940s, in the Ukraine earlier on, or all the way back to Ireland in the early 19th century, when people are starving to death, they will try to sell every brick they have. They will use furniture for fuel. They might even eat the thatch from their roofs. But what happened in China from 58 to 62 is something of an altogether very different order. Let me give you an example. Liu Shaoqi, the head of state, number 2 in the hierarchy in China, in 1961, travels to his home province, the home province of Mao Zedong as well, Hunan province. And after a couple of weeks of investigating, he writes to Mao and tells him that in his province, up to 40% of all housing has been destroyed. 40% of all housing has been destroyed. In certain areas of Sichuan, it goes up to 60, 80% of all housing. How could that possibly happen? Well, initially, with this belief and a great leap forward, what is needed, it seems, in order to produce ever greater crops in the countryside, is fertilizer, besides, of course, water. So what is done in the initial months of the Great Leap Forward is that mud huts are being destroyed turned to roll and used as fertilizer distributed over the fields. But bit by bit, as local cadres start emulating each other, increasing number of houses are being destroyed as fertilizer. And then there are other reasons. Here, after all, is a great leap forward into communism. Why not get rid of all these local huts in this backward village, where no doubt we will have skyscrapers in a year or two? Why not just go ahead of the plan and destroy all of it? Why not straighten the road? Why not take away all the bricks from these private homes and use them to build these collective canteens, these collective kindergartens, these collective dormitories? But most of all, of course, houses are destroyed to punish the people who live inside. This, after all, by 1959, has become a war between the state and the farmers. The farmers try, as well as they can, to keep back as much of the food as possible. The cows have to extract it at all costs. They'll try to see if there's any grain hidden under the floorboards, or behind a second wall, or under the roof. If they can't find anything, sometimes they will destroy the house, or take away bricks, or doors, or furniture. Well, the extent of devastation is extraordinary. Housing, human beings, a lot more than that. The transportation system grinds to a halt by the end of 1958, already unable to cope with all the demands that a command economy creates, having to send goods from one end of the country to the other. Here is a plan that looks perfect on paper, but creates chaos on the ground. There isn't enough fuel to run the trucks. There aren't enough trucks to actually take all the grain that has been procured in that very same province of Hunan, home province of Mao Zedong. During one summer in 1960, up to 140,000 tons of grain that have been procured rot along the roads in the countryside because there aren't enough trucks to actually collect it. In places like Shanghai, hundreds of millions of yuan worth of goods are stored and left uncollected. By Zhengzhou railway station, the people in charge of the railway station dig a ditch that is several meters deep, and they pour goods into it that can't be collected. Cement, machinery, tools, anything that arise on a freight train is poured into it. It can't be sent any further. Nature. I mentioned these massive irrigation projects. Hundreds of thousands of poor farmers are sent, sometimes to places far beyond the village, to go and build dams, canals, reservoirs, with the idea that if somehow China could control the flow of water, it could have that great leap forward into a utopian future. But all too often, these projects are very poorly executed. What matters most is actually to move earth, to show that each province, each county, each village, each brigade can actually move more earth than the other. So all of these water conservancy projects actually do very little good. They create a lot of landslides, river silting, soil salinization, devastating inundation. The very water that's meant to be contained by all these irrigation projects runs amok. Projects executed often without any regard for local topography. Hu Yaobang, some of you may remember his name. Hu Yaobang, then a rather young man, is sent with a team to explore the inundations along the Huai River Basin and the Yellow River Basin for 3 months in September 1961. And he comes up with one conclusion. There are massive problems here that have been created, not so much by rainfall, by thunderstorms, by typhoons, but by the inability of the earth to retain water. That ability has been destroyed by these massive projects. So destruction at every level: nature, housing, transportation system, the economy, and of course human beings being destroyed. But we have a little bit more time, and I want to turn towards something else. So far we've been looking only at the effects of radical collectivization on that economy. But of course, while many people die unnecessarily in accidents or diseases, punishment, and most of all sheer starvation, being reduced to eating mud to somehow fill one's stomach, many more actually manage to survive. And this is one of the great things about these archives, is that they contain all sorts of interesting documents, sometimes written by ordinary people. Letters of complaint, for instance, sent higher up to a newspaper, the People's Daily. Or investigations by the Bureau for Labor into how miners actually lead their lives during the Great Leap Forward. All sorts of very interesting documents about how people manage to somehow cope with starvation and destruction at such a devastating scale. And one of the techniques that people develop in the countryside and in the cities in order to get by is precisely to do the opposite of what is required of them by the state. Namely, do as little as is possible. I see there are quite a few students here. I'm sure you've mastered that technique. Pretend that you're listening, but just sit back and conserve every ounce of energy. Look interested. You know, when the teacher walks past you, but then immediately get back to whatever it is you were doing earlier on. Well, people become masters of time theft. They try to conserve every ounce of energy. Here are posters against the wall, exhorting people to work, loudspeakers, blasting out exhortations to work harder, fulfill more quotas, overtake the Soviet Union or England or the United States or God knows what other abstract entity. Do more, produce more, work harder. In fact, people try to do as little as possible. In the countryside, of course, slacking, to use a term used by the regime, is not just the effect of malnourishment, it's a technique that is essential to get through the day. So sometimes farmers will till and work in the fields under the watchful eye of a passing carver, but as soon as that official is gone, they will drop their tools, sit by the side of the field and just wait. They manage to get better organized if, for instance, they have a village leader who's actually on their side. They might actually have their own sentries along the fields that will warn them of an approaching carver. They might actually huddle together. Entire families might sleep for days on end, trying to get through that famine as well as possible. But of course, stealing time is not quite enough to get you through all the misery created by radical collectivization. You need to feed yourself. So theft becomes endemic, very much ruled by opportunity and need. And opportunity is greatest in the cities, whether it is shopkeepers who rummage through the back of the shop, or assistants who will somehow fake a receipt or steal from the till, or workers who will try to get away with whatever it is they produce and sell it on the black market. The opportunities to steal something in the city are great. But in the countryside, theft is very much governed by need. Just about everybody must steal, or at least try to steal something, in order to get through these many years of extreme deprivation. It might be a handful once in a while that might just about get you through. But there's very little choice left here. Even people who resent the idea of having to steal might actually be forced to take something from somebody else. At first, that somebody else is a rather abstract entity called the state. Throughout the entire cycle of production, farmers try to steal what they can. It starts before the crop has even reached maturity. It's called 吃青. It harks back to an old tradition during the empire of clipping off spikes of grain, for instance corn, while it's still green, straight from the field, and then you try to somehow mix it in your hand. You eat it raw. You eat the whole thing raw. You don't cook it. You basically act like a locust. You descend on the field. You take as much as you can. You eat it right away. Once the grain has been collected, sometimes farmers, sometimes village leaders try to bulk up the grain with water. In Guangdong province, 1/3 of all the grain in state storages contains too much water and actually rots. And it's not just humidity. You can find the same in the much drier provinces in the north. People try to bulk up the grain as much as they can with water. It makes it heavier. You have to deliver less of it. You can keep more of it to feed your own people. Once grain has been collected and it is on the move, it goes through a lot of grasping hands, guards in grain storages, steel, shippers use bamboo tubes that go straight through grain sacks. They will suck out the food, put sand back into the bags. The cooks in these collective canteens try to filter as much as they can. By the time about a pound of grain actually reaches the canteen, 50% of it is gone, vanished, pilfered at every single level. Now, this all sounds rather good, but bit by bit, of course, as starvation really sets in, people start stealing from each other. With mass devastation, mass destruction, come routine degradations where people have to start taking from each other because there's nobody else you can actually take from. People turn on each other, their neighbors. Sometimes families themselves become arenas for jealousy and strife. There's one report that shows that a man called Wang Jiuchang, a small place just outside of Nanjing called Youhe, systematically takes the food ration allocated to his 8-year-old daughter. And when it gets too cold in the winter, he takes her cotton jacket, takes her trousers. This girl dies of cold and misery and hunger in the middle of the winter. There are many other examples of people turning against each other. So theft is not always a sort of glorious act of resistance against the state. On the contrary, people have to make absolutely horrendous choices in order to get by. And many refuse to make them. There are a lot of reports about mothers who will tie their children onto their backs and just jump into a river because they cannot decide whether they should take the food from their own child to feed themselves or starve themselves and feed the child. It's quite a horrendous situation to which people are reaching. This is not passive, but there are also acts of rebellion. Sometimes that very passive shield that outsiders mistake for submissiveness breaks down and villages erupt in a real rage.